The morning sun cast a golden glow across Millfield Park as the Henderson family arrived for their annual reunion picnic. Sarah Henderson stepped out of her minivan, breathing in the crisp autumn air while her husband Mike unloaded coolers from the back. Their twins, Emma and Jake, both 12, raced ahead toward the large oak tree where 3 generations of Hendersons had gathered for the past 15 years. The park buzzed with the cheerful chaos of families claiming their spots, children's laughter echoing across the meadow, the distant sound of a softball game, and the smoky aroma of barbecues beginning to fire up for the day. Grandpa Joe, now 82 but still spry, had already claimed their usual spot under the sprawling branches of the ancient oak. He'd spread out the faded checkered tablecloth that had seen countless family gatherings, its edges frayed with memories. "Right on time," he called out with a grin, adjusting his weathered baseball cap. Grandma Rose emerged from behind the tree, having finished arranging wildflowers she'd picked on her morning walk. Her silver hair caught the sunlight as she waved enthusiastically at the approaching family members. Uncle Dave and Aunt Linda arrived moments later with their teenage daughter Chloe, who immediately pulled out her phone to document the day on social media. "This lighting is perfect," she announced, snapping pictures of the picturesque setting. Cousin Marcus, fresh out of college, jogged up with a frisbee tucked under his arm and a cooler of his famous homemade lemonade. The family quickly fell into their familiar rhythm, the adults setting up tables and unpacking food while the younger generation claimed the nearby field for games. Sarah felt a deep contentment wash over her as she watched her family interact. These gatherings had become more precious as the years passed, especially after losing her father-in-law 2 winters ago. She caught Mike's eye and smiled, knowing he was thinking the same thing. They'd both been working too many hours lately, caught up in the demands of their careers, but days like this reminded them what truly mattered. The twins were already organizing a game of tag with their cousins, their voices carrying across the park as they established the rules with the serious intensity only children could muster. As the morning progressed, more family members trickled in. Great Aunt Martha arrived with her famous potato salad, complaining good-naturedly about the drive from the city. Cousin Beth brought her new boyfriend, nervously introducing him to the clan while he clutched a store-bought pie like a shield. The Henderson family had a reputation for being welcoming but protective, and new additions to the family gatherings were always subjected to gentle but thorough questioning disguised as friendly conversation. The picnic tables groaned under the weight of traditional family favorites, Rose's legendary fried chicken, Dave's championship chili, Sarah's 3-layer chocolate cake, and dozens of side dishes that had been passed down through generations. Each dish came with its own story, its own memory attached to family members both present and fondly remembered. The preparation had started days ago, with family members coordinating menus through group texts and phone calls, ensuring nothing was forgotten and no dish was duplicated. Around noon, as the sun reached its peak and cast dappled shadows through the oak leaves, the family gathered for their traditional group photo. Grandpa Joe insisted on using his old film camera alongside the digital ones, maintaining that real pictures were printed on paper, not stored in clouds. They arranged themselves in their usual formation, tallest in back, shortest in front, with Grandma Rose in the center holding the newest addition to the family, Aunt Linda's golden retriever puppy, Buster. The afternoon stretched ahead of them with planned activities that had become beloved traditions. There would be the annual softball game between the kids and the adults, though the line between these categories had blurred over the years. The treasure hunt that Grandpa Joe organized each year for the youngest family members was already hidden throughout the park, with clues that would lead them on an adventure through the woods and meadows. Later, as the sun began to set, they would gather around the fire pit that Mike had built years ago, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories that grew more embellished with each telling. But first it was time for the feast. As the family lined up with their plates, chattering about everything from work and school to weekend plans and family gossip, none of them noticed the unusual silence that had fallen over the other picnic areas. The distant sounds of other families had gradually faded, replaced by an odd stillness that seemed to hover at the edges of their awareness. The Henderson family, caught up in their own joy and traditions, remained blissfully unaware that their perfect day was about to take a terrifying turn that would test every bond they shared and challenge their very survival. Emma Henderson was the first to notice something wasn't right. She had been chasing her cousin Jake around the oak tree when she suddenly stopped mid-stride, her head tilted like a curious puppy listening to a distant sound. "Does anyone else think it's gotten really quiet?" she asked, her 12-year-old voice cutting through the family's cheerful chatter. The adults paused their conversations, forks halfway to their mouths, and listened. What had moments before been a symphony of family activities, children playing on nearby swings, dogs barking, other families calling to each other across the park, had faded to an unsettling silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Mike Henderson set down his plate of barbecue and stood up, shading his eyes with his hand as he scanned the park. The picnic area that had been bustling with at least 6 other families just an hour ago now appeared eerily deserted. Abandoned blankets lay scattered on the grass, some with food still spread out as if families had simply vanished mid-meal. A red beach ball rolled slowly across an empty field, pushed by the autumn breeze with no children running after it. Even the parking lot, which had been full when they arrived, now showed gaps where cars had been, though none of them remembered hearing engines starting or vehicles leaving. "That's strange," Grandpa Joe murmured, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his folding chair as he struggled to stand. His military training from decades past had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him something was wrong. "In 40 years of coming to this park, I've never seen it clear out this fast." Grandma Rose moved closer to him, unconsciously seeking the comfort of his presence as an inexplicable chill seemed to settle over their gathering despite the warm afternoon sun. Uncle Dave, ever the practical one, decided to investigate. He was the type of man who fixed problems rather than worried about them, and the mystery of the empty park presented a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. "I'm going to check on the Johnsons," he announced, referring to a family they'd nodded to earlier who had been set up near the playground. "Maybe they know what's going on." He started walking across the field, his confident stride carrying him toward the abandoned picnic area, while Aunt Linda called after him to be careful. As Dave approached the deserted picnic spot, he could see that food was still laid out on their table, sandwiches half-eaten, a pitcher of lemonade with condensation still beating on its sides, children's toys scattered in the grass as if dropped in haste. But there was something else that made his steps slow and his heart rate quicken. Dark stains had pooled in the grass near one of the overturned chairs, stains that looked suspiciously like blood in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. From the edge of the woods, approximately 50 yards away, a figure emerged. At first glance, it appeared to be a park visitor who might have gotten lost or injured on one of the hiking trails. The person moved with an unsteady gait, stumbling occasionally and seeming disoriented. Dave's natural instinct to help kicked in immediately, and he changed direction to intercept what he assumed was someone in need of assistance. "Hey there," he called out, raising his hand in a friendly wave. "You okay? Need some help?" Back at the Henderson family gathering, Sarah felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping up her spine. She watched her brother-in-law approaching the stumbling figure and noticed something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The person's clothes were torn and stained, not with mud or typical hiking mishaps, but with something darker and more disturbing. Even from this distance, she could see that the individual's movements weren't just unsteady. They were wrong somehow, as if the person had forgotten how human bodies were supposed to move. "Dave, wait," she called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made several family members look up from their plates. But Dave was already within 20 feet of the stranger, his helpful nature overriding any sense of caution. The figure had noticed his approach and was now moving toward him with what seemed like renewed purpose, though its gait remained disturbingly awkward. Mike started jogging toward his brother, sensing his wife's alarm and trusting her instincts. The twins moved closer to their mother, some primitive part of their young minds recognizing the tension that had suddenly charged the air around their peaceful family gathering. Grandpa Joe was reaching for his walking stick, his old soldier's reflexes awakening after decades of dormancy. What happened next would shatter their perfect family day and thrust them into a nightmare none of them could have imagined. The stumbling figure suddenly lunged at Dave with inhuman speed and aggression, and the Henderson family's world changed forever in that single horrifying moment. The attack on Uncle Dave happened so quickly that for a moment, the Henderson family's minds struggled to process what they were witnessing. The disheveled figure had launched itself at Dave with a ferocity that defied human behavior, knocking him to the ground with inhuman strength. Dave's shocked cry of pain and confusion carried across the field, snapping his family out of their stunned paralysis. Mike broke into a sprint, his protective instincts overriding any sense of personal safety as he raced to help his brother. Behind him, Aunt Linda screamed Dave's name, her voice raw with terror and disbelief at what was unfolding before their eyes. As Mike closed the distance, he could see Dave struggling beneath his attacker, trying to push the person away while shouting for help. But what chilled Mike to his core was the attacker's complete lack of response to Dave's pleas or attempts at communication. The figure moved with single-minded purpose, showing no sign of hearing or understanding anything around it. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer, yet somehow possessed of terrible strength and determination. Sarah gathered the twins close to her, her maternal instincts screaming at her to protect her children from whatever nightmare was unfolding. "Stay behind me," she whispered urgently, her eyes never leaving the struggle in the field. Emma and Jake pressed against their mother, their earlier playfulness completely forgotten as they watched their uncle fight for his life. Grandpa Joe had managed to stand and was making his way toward the conflict as quickly as his aged legs would carry him, his walking stick gripped like a weapon in his weathered hands. When Mike reached the struggle, he grabbed the attacker by the shoulders and tried to pull the person off his brother. What he felt beneath his hands made him recoil in horror. The skin was cold and clammy, with an unnatural texture that felt wrong against his palms. Worse yet, when the figure turned toward him, Mike found himself staring into eyes that showed no spark of human recognition or intelligence. They were clouded and vacant, yet somehow filled with an insatiable hunger that made his blood run cold. The attacker's face was a mask of decay and violence, with dark stains around the mouth that Mike's mind refused to identify. When it opened its mouth and lunged toward him, he could see that its teeth were stained with something dark and terrible. Mike stumbled backward, his rational mind struggling to accept what his eyes were telling him. This wasn't a person having a medical emergency or psychological breakdown. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural order of the world. "Get away from it!" Grandpa Joe shouted as he arrived at the scene, his military training helping him assess the threat more quickly than the others. He swung his walking stick with surprising force, connecting with the attacker's head and creating enough of a distraction for Dave to scramble away. But instead of falling or showing pain, the figure simply turned its attention to Joe, seemingly unaffected by the blow that would have stunned any normal person. From their position by the oak tree, the rest of the family watched in growing horror as more figures began to emerge from various directions around the park. They stumbled out from behind trees, from the parking lot, and from the direction of the now silent playground. Each one moved with that same disturbing gait, that same purposeful yet unnatural motion that defied explanation. Some were dressed in hiking clothes, others in family picnic attire, but all shared the same vacant expressions and predatory focus. Cousin Marcus, his college psychology classes failing to provide any framework for what he was witnessing, pulled out his cell phone to call for help. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911, but instead of the familiar ring tone, he was greeted by an automated message stating that all circuits were busy. He tried again, then checked his signal, full bars but no connection. "The phones aren't working," he announced, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining composure. Chloe, who had been documenting their perfect family day just minutes earlier, now held her phone with shaking hands as she tried to live stream what was happening. "Nobody's going to believe this," she whispered, but her social media apps showed the same error messages as the phone calls. No connection, no signal, no way to reach the outside world for help. The horrifying realization began to dawn on each family member simultaneously. They were completely alone, cut off from help, facing something that none of them understood but all of them instinctively feared. The peaceful park that had been their sanctuary for 15 years had become a trap, and the loving family gathering that had started with such joy and hope was now a fight for survival against an enemy that defied explanation or reason. The chaos erupted with terrifying suddenness as more of the infected figures closed in from multiple directions, their unnatural movements creating a tightening circle around the Henderson family's picnic area. Grandpa Joe, drawing on decades-old military instincts, quickly assessed their tactical situation and realized they had only moments before being completely surrounded. "We need to move now," he shouted, his authoritative voice cutting through the family's panic and confusion. But as they began to gather their essentials, the approaching threats forced them to make split-second decisions that would tear their close-knit group apart. A cluster of infected individuals emerged from the tree line between the family and the parking lot, effectively cutting off what had seemed like their most obvious escape route. Sarah, clutching Emma and Jake's hands tightly, found herself separated from Mike and the older family members when one of the creatures lunged directly at their group. Her maternal instincts took over completely, and she pulled her children toward the only clear path she could see, a narrow opening that led toward the park's maintenance area and parking lot. "This way," she called desperately to the others, but her voice was lost in the chaos of shouting and the disturbing sounds coming from their attackers. Mike turned to follow his wife and children but found his path blocked by two more infected individuals who had approached from the playground area. Uncle Dave, still shaken from his attack but determined to help, grabbed a heavy cooler and swung it at the nearest threat, buying Mike precious seconds to assess their situation. However, those seconds revealed a heartbreaking reality. Sarah and the twins were already too far away, running toward what they hoped was safety, while Mike and most of the family were being forced in the opposite direction toward the park's old maintenance building. "Sarah!" Mike shouted, his voice breaking with desperation as he watched his family disappear around a cluster of pine trees. He started to chase after them, but Grandpa Joe grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You'll get yourself killed and won't help them," the old man said firmly, his military experience recognizing the tactical impossibility of Mike's impulse. "We need to find shelter and regroup. They're smart, they'll do the same." Meanwhile, Sarah's heart pounded as she guided Emma and Jake through the maze of picnic tables and playground equipment, constantly looking over her shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The twins, despite their fear, showed remarkable courage and obedience, staying close to their mother and following her instructions without question. Emma's sharp eyes spotted a gap in the fence near the parking lot, and she tugged her mother's sleeve to point it out. "Mom, over there, we can get through." As they squeezed through the fence opening, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of Mike and the rest of their family. She could hear distant shouts and what sounded like breaking glass coming from the direction they'd fled, but she forced herself to focus on her immediate priority, keeping her children safe. They reached her minivan, and Sarah's hands shook as she fumbled for her keys, constantly scanning the parking lot for any signs of the infected individuals. Back near the maintenance building, Mike's group had managed to reach the small structure that housed park equipment and tools. Cousin Marcus used his shoulder to force open the door while Uncle Dave and Grandpa Joe created a barrier using picnic tables they'd grabbed during their retreat. Aunt Linda and Grandma Rose helped barricade the windows with whatever materials they could find, their movements efficient despite the terror they all felt. Inside the cramped building, surrounded by lawnmowers and maintenance equipment, the separated family members tried to catch their breath and make sense of their situation. Mike pulled out his phone again, desperately hoping for a signal, but found the same dead connection that had frustrated them earlier. "We have to assume Sarah and the kids made it to safety," he said, though his voice betrayed his worry. "She's smart and she knows these woods from our hiking trips." Grandpa Joe nodded, but his weathered face showed the strain of their circumstances. "The question is, how long can we stay here before those things find us? And how do we get back to Sarah and the twins?" The maintenance building felt secure for the moment, but they all knew it was only a temporary refuge. Outside they could hear the shuffling sounds of their pursuers, still searching, still hunting. Both groups, Sarah with the twins in the parking lot and Mike's group in the maintenance building, faced the same terrifying reality. They were separated, possibly surrounded, and dealing with an enemy they didn't understand. The Henderson family, which had been unified in joy just hours earlier, was now divided by circumstances beyond their control, each group fighting not just for their own survival but holding on to hope that they would somehow find each other again in this nightmare that had consumed their perfect day. Inside the maintenance building, Grandpa Joe's military training became their lifeline as he assessed their limited resources and began formulating a survival strategy. His weathered hands moved systematically through the building's contents, evaluating each tool and piece of equipment for its potential as either a weapon or a means of protection. "We're not just hiding anymore," he announced to his frightened family members, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced life-and-death situations before. "We need to think like survivors, not victims." He handed Mike a heavy wrench and gave Uncle Dave a garden hoe, while keeping a small hatchet for himself. Marcus, drawing on wilderness survival skills he'd learned during college camping trips, began examining the building's structure for weaknesses and escape routes. He discovered that one of the rear windows could be opened quietly, providing a potential exit that wouldn't be immediately visible to the infected individuals still prowling outside their front door. "If we need to run, we go out the back and head for those dense trees," he whispered, pointing toward a heavily wooded area that could provide cover. His young mind was adapting quickly to their new reality, processing survival information with the same intensity he'd once applied to his studies. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Sarah was discovering her own resourcefulness as she transformed her family minivan into a mobile fortress. She had always been the practical one in the family, the organizer who planned for every contingency during family trips, and now those skills were proving invaluable in their fight for survival. She instructed Emma and Jake to gather anything useful from the vehicle: first aid supplies, bottled water, energy bars she'd packed for their trip home, and even Jake's baseball bat from his weekend game. Emma, despite being only 12, showed remarkable composure as she helped her mother reinforce the van's security. She used duct tape from their emergency kit to secure loose items that might make noise, while Jake kept watch through the tinted windows, his young eyes scanning for any movement in the parking lot. "Mom, I see 3 of them by the main entrance," he reported quietly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Sarah felt a surge of pride at her children's bravery, even as her heart ached for the innocence they were losing. Back in the maintenance building, tragedy struck when Aunt Linda, overwhelmed by anxiety about her husband Dave's earlier injury, made a critical error in judgment. Despite the group's warnings, she attempted to peek through the front window to check on the infected individuals outside, accidentally knocking over a metal tool rack in the process. The crash echoed through the small building like a gunshot, immediately attracting the attention of every creature within hearing distance. The response was swift and terrifying. The infected began converging on the maintenance building with renewed purpose, their shuffling footsteps growing louder as more joined the group outside. Grandpa Joe made a command decision that would save his family but potentially cost him everything. "I'm going to create a distraction," he announced, gripping his hatchet tightly. "When I draw them away from the front, you all go out the back window and head for those trees. Don't look back, don't wait for me, just run." Mike started to protest, but the old man's steely gaze silenced him. "This is what leaders do, son. We make the hard choices so others can survive." Before anyone could stop him, Grandpa Joe had opened the front door and stepped outside, shouting and banging his hatchet against a metal garbage can to attract the infected away from his family's hiding spot. His sacrifice created the diversion they needed, but at a cost that would haunt them forever. In the parking lot, Sarah heard the distant commotion and realized it meant other survivors were fighting for their lives. She started the minivan's engine, her heart torn between the desire to help and the need to protect her children. Emma placed a comforting hand on her mother's shoulder, somehow understanding the impossible choice she was facing. "Dad would want us to be safe first," the young girl said with wisdom beyond her years. "Then we can help them." As Sarah drove carefully through the parking lot, avoiding the main areas where infected individuals were gathering, she kept her eyes open for any sign of Mike and the others. Through her rearview mirror, she could see the chaos unfolding near the maintenance building, but she forced herself to focus on finding a safe place where she and the twins could wait and watch for their family. The sacrifice being made by Grandpa Joe would not be in vain if she could keep her children alive and find a way to reunite with the others. Both groups had learned harsh lessons about survival, resourcefulness, and the terrible choices that desperate situations could force upon loving families. The Henderson clan was discovering strengths they never knew they possessed, but also facing losses that would forever change the fabric of their close-knit family. Grandpa Joe's heroic distraction had worked exactly as planned, drawing the infected away from the maintenance building and giving his family the precious seconds they needed to escape through the rear window. Mike led the desperate exodus, helping Grandma Rose through the opening while Marcus and Uncle Dave gathered the few supplies they could carry. The sound of Joe's shouting and the metallic clanging grew more distant, but so did his voice, and each family member understood the terrible cost of their freedom. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss, only the immediate need to survive and honor his sacrifice by staying alive. The group moved through the dense woods with Marcus leading the way, his wilderness experience proving invaluable as he navigated fallen logs and thick underbrush while keeping them hidden from the main trails. Every snapping twig beneath their feet sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence, and every bird call made them freeze in terror, unsure if it was natural wildlife or something far more sinister. Grandma Rose, despite her age and grief, showed remarkable endurance, though Mike could see the strain in her face as she struggled to keep pace with their urgent flight through the forest. Meanwhile, Sarah had driven her minivan to a small hill overlooking the park, where she could maintain visual contact with the area while keeping her children at a safe distance. From this vantage point, she watched in horror as more infected individuals emerged from places she hadn't expected, the park's restroom facilities, from behind maintenance sheds, even from storm drains that seemed to connect to underground areas. The scope of the outbreak was becoming terrifyingly clear, and she realized that their family picnic had walked directly into the epicenter of something much larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. Emma and Jake pressed against the van's windows, their young eyes searching desperately for any sign of their father and the other family members. "There!" Emma suddenly exclaimed, pointing toward a section of woods where she could see movement that looked more purposeful than the shambling gait of the infected. Sarah grabbed her binoculars from the glove compartment and focused on the area her daughter had indicated, her heart leaping with hope as she recognized Mike's distinctive blue shirt moving through the trees. Back in the woods, Mike's group had discovered something that would change their survival strategy completely, an old storm shelter that had been built during the Cold War era and largely forgotten by park officials. Marcus had stumbled upon its partially concealed entrance while leading them away from the main trail, and the heavy metal door still bore faded radiation symbols from decades past. Uncle Dave used his considerable strength to force open the rusted mechanism, revealing a dark stairway leading underground to what appeared to be a substantial concrete bunker. The shelter was musty and filled with outdated emergency supplies, but it represented something they hadn't had since the nightmare began. A truly secure location where they could rest, plan, and potentially wait out the immediate danger. Aunt Linda immediately began checking the first aid supplies for anything that might help treat Dave's earlier injuries, while Grandma Rose sat heavily on one of the old benches, finally allowing herself a moment to process the loss of her husband of 57 years. From her position on the hill, Sarah could see that the infected were becoming more organized in their search patterns, moving in groups rather than wandering aimlessly. This development filled her with dread, as it suggested a level of coordination that made them far more dangerous than simple mindless creatures. She realized that their temporary safety in the van was an illusion. They needed to find Mike's group and locate a more permanent refuge before nightfall made movement even more treacherous. Using her cell phone's camera function, Sarah began documenting the infected individual's behavior patterns, hoping to identify safe routes and timing for potential movement. Jake, showing the same analytical mind that made him excel in school, began sketching a rough map of the park based on what they could observe, marking locations where infected were concentrated and identifying potential paths that might allow them to reach the wooded area where they'd last seen movement. The storm shelter provided Mike's group with their first opportunity to truly assess their situation and make plans beyond simple flight. They had water, some food supplies, and most importantly, a defensible position. But they also faced a heartbreaking reality. They were separated from Sarah and the twins with no way to communicate, surrounded by an unknown number of infected individuals, and dealing with the fresh grief of losing the family patriarch who had been their source of strength and wisdom. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the park, both groups understood that their reunion would require careful planning, precise timing, and considerable courage. The storm shelter offered hope for survival, but getting Sarah and the twins safely to that location would demand everything they had learned about these creatures and more luck than any family should need in a single day. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the park that would soon provide cover for movement, Sarah made a decision that would either reunite her family or put them all in mortal danger. She had been observing the infected individuals' patterns for over an hour and noticed they seemed less active during the transition periods between day and night, almost as if the changing light confused their already impaired senses. Using Jake's hand-drawn map and her own careful observations, she identified a route that would take them through the densest part of the woods, avoiding the main trails where most of the infected seemed to congregate. "We're going to find Daddy and the others," she announced to Emma and Jake, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. The twins exchanged glances, their young faces showing a mixture of terror and determination that broke Sarah's heart. They had grown up so much in just a few hours, forced to confront realities that most adults never faced. Emma nodded solemnly and began gathering their supplies, while Jake carefully folded his makeshift map and tucked it into his pocket like a precious treasure. Inside the storm shelter, Mike's group had been making their own preparations for what they all knew would be a dangerous attempt to locate Sarah and the twins. The shelter's old emergency supplies included several flashlights, though Mike worried that any light source might attract unwanted attention in the growing darkness. Marcus had discovered a cache of emergency flares from the Cold War era, and while they were decades old, they might still provide a way to signal their location if Sarah was watching for them. Uncle Dave, despite his earlier injuries, insisted on being part of any rescue attempt. "That's my nephew and niece out there," he said firmly when Mike suggested he should stay with Grandma Rose and Aunt Linda. "I'm not sitting in this bunker while they're in danger." His determination reminded everyone of Grandpa Joe's sacrifice, and they understood that the family's survival depended not just on individual courage but on their willingness to risk everything for each other. The plan they developed was both simple and terrifying in its complexity. Marcus would lead Mike and Dave through the woods using a route that paralleled the main trail but stayed hidden in the deeper forest. They would move in 15-minute intervals, stopping to listen and assess their surroundings before continuing. If they encountered infected individuals, they would avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary, understanding that any noise could bring more creatures down upon them. Sarah's journey with the twins began just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They moved slowly and carefully, with Emma leading because her smaller size allowed her to navigate the underbrush more quietly than the adults. Jake brought up the rear, constantly checking behind them for any signs of pursuit. Sarah found herself amazed by her children's adaptability and courage. They followed her instructions without question, communicated through hand signals they improvised on the spot, and showed a level of maturity that both proud and heartbroken her. The two groups began converging on the storm shelter from different directions, neither knowing exactly where the other was but both driven by the desperate hope of reunion. Sarah's group encountered their first real danger when they accidentally disturbed a pair of infected individuals who had been lurking near an old picnic table. The creatures immediately turned toward the sound, their vacant eyes somehow finding Sarah and the twins in the darkness. What followed was the most terrifying few minutes of Sarah's life as she shepherded her children away from the immediate threat while trying to maintain their general direction toward the shelter. Emma stumbled over a fallen branch, and the sound seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. More infected began moving toward their location, drawn by the noise and some instinct that Sarah didn't understand but feared with every fiber of her being. At almost the same moment, Mike's group heard the distant sounds of Sarah's encounter and realized their family was in immediate danger somewhere in the darkness ahead of them. Mike abandoned all caution and began moving quickly toward the sounds, his paternal instincts overriding every survival strategy they had discussed. Dave and Marcus followed, understanding that this was the moment when their family would either be reunited or lost forever. The storm shelter, which had represented safety and hope just hours earlier, now became the focal point of a desperate race against time and an enemy that seemed to grow stronger and more numerous as darkness fell across the park. The Henderson family's bonds were about to be tested in ways that would determine not just their survival, but whether the love that had brought them together for their annual picnic would be strong enough to carry them through the longest night of their lives. The Henderson family's reunion happened in the most unlikely of circumstances, surrounded by darkness, pursued by creatures that defied explanation, and driven together by a love that proved stronger than their terror. Mike heard Emma's frightened cry through the trees and abandoned all stealth, crashing through the underbrush with Dave and Marcus close behind him. When he saw Sarah protecting the twins against two infected individuals, something primal and protective erupted within him, and he struck the nearest creature with his wrench with a force born of desperation and paternal fury. The family's embrace was brief but profound, taking place in a small clearing illuminated only by starlight and the distant glow of emergency flares that Marcus had ignited to mark their location. Sarah buried her face in Mike's shoulder for just a moment, allowing herself to feel the relief of his solid presence before the reality of their situation demanded action. Emma and Jake clung to their father, their small hands gripping his shirt as if they could anchor themselves to safety through sheer force of will. "The shelter's just through those trees," Marcus whispered urgently, pointing toward a barely visible path that led deeper into the woods. Around them, they could hear the shuffling sounds of more infected individuals being drawn to their location by the earlier commotion. The family moved as one unit now, with Mike and Dave forming a protective barrier around Sarah and the twins, while Marcus led them through the darkness using skills he'd never imagined would mean the difference between life and death. They reached the storm shelter just as the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, and the sight of that heavy metal door represented more than just physical safety. It symbolized their survival as a family unit. Inside the shelter, Grandma Rose wept with relief at seeing Sarah and the twins safe, while Aunt Linda immediately began checking them for injuries. The reunited family huddled together in the underground space, sharing water and the few remaining snacks while processing the magnitude of what they had endured. As morning light filtered through the shelter's small ventilation grates, they began to hear sounds that filled them with cautious hope, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles, the rhythmic beating of helicopter rotors, and most importantly human voices calling through loudspeakers. Emergency services had finally arrived, though the family would later learn that their park had been one of several locations affected by what authorities were calling an isolated biological incident. Mike ventured up the shelter stairs first, slowly opening the heavy door to peek outside. What he saw filled him with overwhelming relief: military vehicles positioned throughout the park, personnel in hazmat suits systematically clearing the area, and a command center that had been established near the main parking lot. The infected individuals were being contained and removed by teams that clearly had experience with this type of situation, suggesting that while their nightmare had been terrifyingly real, it was not unprecedented. The family's emergence from the storm shelter marked the end of their ordeal but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. They were immediately quarantined for medical evaluation, a process that was thorough but conducted with kindness by personnel who understood the trauma they had experienced. During the long hours of medical tests and debriefing sessions, the Hendersons clung to each other with a new appreciation for the bonds that had carried them through their darkest hours. Emma and Jake, despite their young age, had shown courage that amazed the emergency responders who interviewed them. Their detailed observations and Jake's hand-drawn map actually proved valuable to the investigation teams trying to understand how the outbreak had spread through the park. The twins had not only survived their ordeal but had contributed meaningfully to ensuring it wouldn't happen to other families. In the weeks that followed, as they attended counseling sessions and slowly returned to their normal routines, the Henderson family discovered that their experience had changed them in ways both profound and subtle. They treasured their time together with an intensity that sometimes surprised friends and neighbors, and they found themselves more aware of life's fragility and preciousness than ever before. The annual family picnic tradition would continue, but it would be held in Sarah's backyard from now on, surrounded by familiar walls and the comfort of known safety. Grandpa Joe's sacrifice had not been in vain. His courage had saved his family and allowed them to write this story of survival rather than tragedy. His memory became a source of strength that would bind the Henderson family together for generations to come, a reminder that love and selflessness could triumph even in the darkest circumstances. As they sat around Sarah's dinner table months later, sharing stories and laughter, they understood that their bond had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever, proving that some things, family, love, and hope, could survive even the most unimaginable challenges.